David, this is a podcast with a tagline
And the tagline is actual evolutionary psychology.
by actual evolutionary psychologists.
And what is your name?
David Pietrzewski, but I go by Dave because your
Eh,
name is.
David Pinsoff. I have the id. I'm the immature one.
Yeah, and we're both David Pease, so we have to distinguish ourselves somehow.
Yeah. Anyway, here we are. Enjoy.
David, what does the word epistemic mean?
It means relating to knowledge.
Mm, good. Well, there's a reason why I'm asking that because the person we're going to talk to today is Hugo Mercier, and he is at
The Institut Jean Nicod in France. Uh,
Yeah, where he works with the evolution and social cognition team, and he does a lot on epistemic vigilance and why we believe certain things, and also reasoning.
That's right. He's one of many people coming from the Paris School of Cultural Evolution, the French School of Evolutionary Psychology, which I am a huge fan of. I think everyone coming out of that area is just fantastic, and he is leading the vanguard of people studying fascinating topics related to reasoning, epistemic vigilance, misinformation, belief. We get into all those topics and more.
Yeah, this is a very dense episode. We narrowed the timing down, and we just got right into it, the entire episode, and it was wonderful. And definitely encourage you to look up Hugo and his work, and he has a couple books too.
Yeah, wonderful books. The Enigma of Reason is his first book about the evolutionary psychology of reasoning, and Not Born Yesterday about the evolutionary psychology of gullibility, or rather, our not being gullible, our epistemic vigilance.
Yeah, well, and without further ado, today, enjoy Hugo and David and myself.
Enjoy.
I'm just gonna turn off the
Yeah, your
Bluetooth on my
phone.
phone, otherwise it's
Good
gonna interrupt
idea.
the recording. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna turn off those
It's like an
sounds.
airplane where you
It's
have to
gonna tell
turn
my
off.
Wi-Fi a bit later
You
than
have to
that's a
turn off
bit
put it on your plane setting. Everybody put your devices on a plane setting.
yeah.
Is that true? Like, is that, David, do you know?
Did you actually have to turn off
Yeah,
your phone and stuff on an airplane?
yeah.
Or I mean, why would you think they're just like messing with us?
Yes and no. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's
I don't think they're, well, I don't know.
just doing it for no reason.
Well, there's sort of, it's the principle of sort of like the 1% of the time where there's an issue, the 99%
Mm,
get turned off. I don't know.
yeah, maybe. Well,
Yeah.
speaking of percentages,
Yeah, this is a
we have
good
with us,
start. Hugo just
it's a great
mentioned how, yeah,
segue.
exactly.
Um,
We have shorter time today, so
we
everyone's
have
like, "Oh, thank goodness, an hour and a half." Yeah.
so we have the premier scholar of reasoning with us, Hugo Mercier. He has a wonderful book called The Enigma of Reason. We're talking about percentages. Uh, Percentages are a kind of reasoning, or reasoning about, how much of X or Y remains after some activity. So Hugo, um, is reasoning a solitary activity where we sit down in our chairs and we think through a syllogism like if P then Q, and then we use that to make a better decision, or is it something else?
So what you're describing does happen.
Mhm.
It's been known to happen. But
Yeah.
the point that Dan Sperber and I have been making in a number of publications is that we don't think that's what reasoning is for. So in evolutionary terms, we've suggested that the function of reason, of human reason, is not to think about things on your own and to weigh the pros and cons and to try to arrive at better decisions, but on the contrary, to reason with others, to exchange arguments, to exchange justifications. Still, this is an evolutionary psychology podcast. It's important to specify that it doesn't have a group function. The goal isn't to get things better for everybody. The point is still purely individual, but instead of the point being to just reason better on your own, the point, or the points rather, are both to convince others, to change other people's minds, and to have your mind changed when you should. So when other people have good reasons, so you can change your mind and adopt, or at least move towards their views.
Hmm. So that's a crucial distinction. So you mentioned that we evolved to reason in groups. But reasoning did not evolve for the good of the group. It, in fact, evolved for the good of the individual, and that the individual benefits by persuading the person they're arguing with, or perhaps justifying their behavior to the person they're talking with, and that gains them reputational benefits. It might help them manipulate others to their own end, and as a byproduct of everybody sort of pursuing their individual self-interest and trying to persuade each other and justify themselves, sometimes what you get is an emergent outcome, which is good for the group. So if everyone is arguing their own case, then you get a kind of intellectual division of labor, where a bunch of different views get people fired up and focused on the particular reasons for that view, and then you get you get a bunch of different people working on justifications for different views, and the views that rise to the top, that succeed, that prevail, tend to be the ones that are more well justified, well reasoned. Is that basically the claim you're making?
Yeah, exactly. And that's because on the one hand, so when you're producing arguments, when you're producing reasons, when you're reasoning in a more active manner, indeed your goal is to either when you're doing it live, kind of just to persuade people to change their minds either about the conclusion you're trying to defend, or at least about what they think of you when you're justifying yourself. You don't, you want you want them to think that your choices and your beliefs are rational. Um, but there's also the more kind of passive position, which is when you're evaluating other people's reasons and arguments and justifications. And then your goal is much more objective. The goal is really to figure out, are these good reasons? And should I change my mind on the basis of these reasons? And the two of them are really completely necessary for group, for both for individuals, because if my goal was to convince others, but they would never change their minds, then obviously it would be pointless. But it's also how the kind of the phenomenon you are describing of groups ending up better off. It's also thanks to that because people do change their minds when they are confronted with good arguments.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about proximate versus ultimate, or sort of whether or not you're conscious of something. Hugo, how do you think about this in the following sense? I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, I don't experience myself at all, sort of thinking, well, what's in it for me? Starting with that, and then sort of going through thinking and deciding whether or not to take some evidence or to reach a conclusion. I mean, I think we all have the experience of doing that, of biased reasoning. But then we have also the experience of, for a lot of us, most of the time, not doing it. And is your argument that even that category, that second category of not consciously experiencing stuff, there's still this software that we're not even conscious of? Is that a fair characterization, or how
Exactly,
do you think about it? Yeah.
exactly. That's the point. So obviously, no one is surprised that a lawyer or a politician, when they are practicing a speech or a plea, will be specifically looking for arguments that support their clients or their cause or whatever else. And when that happens, even if they happen to stumble upon a counter argument, they won't mention it. They'll just only go for the arguments that support whatever it is they want to support. And that's a very kind of strategic things to do. And it's not the pure expression of reasoning. It involves other mechanisms that will make it even more biased, or but in that case, in a way that makes sense. No, the point we're trying to make is that even when we're reasoning in a completely, kind of normal manner, the function of the mechanism is social, and obviously we're not aware of it in the same way as when we're having sex, we're not aware of the fact that the function of this is to pass on our genes. I mean, except maybe Elon Musk or a few people who really do it for that reason. But so it's the same. Obviously, we're not supposed to have access to the kind of the ultimate functions of our cognitive mechanisms.
Yeah.
Could
Are there
could
design features? Sorry, David. Are there design? So it just in the same way, like having sex, right? It's sort of, it's not just empty that the function of it is producing offspring. There's all kinds of design features about like who we find attractive that follow because that's the function. And so, have you discovered, are there attributes of reasoning that people might not know that are design features because the function is argument that might be different than the design features people might think if the function was just sort of impartial, the learning of the truth?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I think actually our theory mostly explains features of reasoning that were known, but that were taken for granted and that should have been
Mm,
mysterious. So,
mm,
it is quite well known and quite well established in evolutionary psychology, in the psychology of reasoning and judgment and decision making, that people have a confirmation bias or my side bias. So whenever you're reasoning about anything, whether you're on your own or you're talking with others, you will spontaneously find overwhelmingly arguments that support your view. And just as an aside, one of the best experimental demonstrations of that is an experiment done by some Swedish psychologists using the choice blindness paradigm. So in that experiment, people like the experimenters pretend to be kind of pollsters asking questions to people on the street, and they have a little clipboard with a sheet full of questions, and the questions could be something like, do you think, like in the trade-off between security and freedom to like fight terrorism, for instance, do you think that security or freedom matters most? And people have a scale, from like one, which means like I mostly care about security, or seven, I mostly care about freedom. And they circle the number that fits with their opinions. And they do that for a number of questions. And then they give the clipboard with a sheet back to the experimenter, who uses a sleight of hand to actually to copy, to kind of glue onto the sheet a question that spells the opposite of the original question. So if the original question was, I think that freedom matters more than safety. Then the new question reads, I think that safety matters more than freedom. And so, but people's answers are the same. So if you've circled six the first time around, you still have a six that's circled. But now the six means the opposite of what it used to mean. And so, they say, well, that people look, here is the questions back. Now I'm going to ask you to justify your opinions. Why do you think? Where do you have that point of view? And what they found is that first of all, only like 5% of participants realized that they had been tricked in that way. It's like a very small number of participants realized. And of those participants who didn't realize, so the overwhelming majority, these people were as able to produce arguments for the view that they had originally said was theirs as for the other view. So it's quite striking. And in that case, we know it's purely a confirmation bias, because it's not the case that people just have a lot of reasons that they would support freedom over safety or security. Um, Instead, they just make stuff up on the spot, and they're
Mm,
equally able to make stuff up for both views.
mm,
So this is the kind of confirmation bias or my side bias. And if you thought that the function of reason was to help you commit better decisions on your own, or arrive at better beliefs, such a bias would be completely self-defeating, in the sense that you're thinking about things and you're trying to consider the pros and cons of various decisions. If whatever original intuition or feeling you have, you only find reasons supporting that, you will never change your mind. So if you start wrong, you will never get better. So that's really the opposite of what you'd want from a mechanism that is supposed to help you, think things through and reevaluate your own opinions. So this confirmation bias or my side bias, whose existence has been known for a long time, for us it makes a lot of sense, in the sense that when you're producing reasons, you want to convince other people. And so if you want to convince someone, obviously you want to find reasons for your point of view or against theirs. You don't want to do you don't want to do the opposite. And it is hard. Like, we can do it, but it's really hard. When you ask people, if you ask a hardcore Democrat, can you think of good reasons why people may be voting for Trump? It's going to be really hard for them as a rule. It's possible, but it's a hard exercise. So that's one of the features of reason that we think our theory can account for.
So you mentioned this uh, very disturbing finding where people will be tricked into thinking that they answered a survey the opposite way that they actually answered it, and then they will just basically make stuff up or confabulate a justification or a reason why they chose that response, even though they in fact didn't. And what's disturbing about this is that it suggests that we might be doing this more or less all the time. Every time we do something, we start a podcast, we invite someone onto a podcast, we might
Apropos of
confabulate a
nothing, yeah.
reason. So the reason we're starting this podcast is
Uh,
because we're interested in reaching the truth and spreading truth to the masses. Well, that might be a kind of confabulation that Dave and I tell. The exception, though, is that it's true in our case, but in everyone else's case,
sure, yes, exactly.
it's not true. One question I have for you is a kind of game theoretic question. So if everyone is confabulating bullshit reasons for their behavior, more or less, and I am a fan of that word. And bullshit in this in the sense that the confabulation is not designed to accurately detect the underlying motives of the behavior, but it's designed to convey a positive impression, look competent or benevolent or whatever, maybe fit the prevailing social norms. If that is the function of these justifications, why do we believe each other's justifications? Why don't we just say, Dave, you're telling me this story for why you were interested in starting this podcast. When I say, Dave, you're full of shit. Why, I don't believe you. Like, it seems like much
Mm.
of our culture involves giving reasons for our behavior, and much of the time we're actually quite gullible, for lack of a better word, of people's justifications. And our culture is kind of made up from these bullshit reasons, for lack of a better term. So why do we accept these reasons if they're coming from such a epistemically unreliable place?
So thanks for the question. So I don't think it's that unreliable. So first of all, obviously there has to be some simplification in the sense that our motives are necessarily complicated, and so it would be impossible to just just express them in a simple way whenever we want someone asks us why we're doing something. But I do think that we're not that gullible, and that if you gave people a motive that had nothing to do with your actual motives, most people would call you up on it, and indeed most people do, and most of the justifications we give are actually decent justifications. Um, the situation in which it's more likely to have justifications that are really made up is when they suit everybody. So usually when you have to justify something, it's because you expect that someone else, either you can see someone else is judging you, they're asking you, why did you do this? But most of the time we anticipate other people judging us, and we give them reasons for what we've done to anticipate being judged negatively. So if you do something, you break the law on the road or something, you say, well, I was in a rush, or I didn't see the car coming. So you're going to explain your behavior kind of in a preemptive manner. Um, and so usually things work well because you have these other people to keep you in check. So then again, if you say something that has nothing to do with reality, or that is not plausible, given your personality, given your context, people won't accept it. But sometimes, as a group of people, or even as a society, we're happy to have justifications that are, that we could present to someone else, or that they never really get properly evaluated. And these are the ones for which it's kind of easier to get away with stuff that is less plausible. Um, like, to give you examples, like in most, or maybe every small scale society, people believe in witches, or in kind of some form of supernatural entity that causes many, or kind of most misfortunes. And it's plausible that people have good reasons for wanting to be able to blame a given individual for a given misfortune. And like, it's not just one person, it's like the group as a whole is happy enough to converge on the idea that, well, we don't have to all share the responsibility for that guy's misfortune. We're just going to say it's that guy's fault. And except for that guy, everybody else is kind of happy to believe that. And so they can make up justifications that, from an outside perspective, might not be super convincing. But given that everybody is kind of looking for a justification, the threshold for, or the criteria are kind of quite low. You don't need something super good because everybody just wants to have a justification. And that's the
Mm.
risk when you're talking to people who agree with you, and you're finding reasons, or justifications for your views. They're not going to be critically evaluated, and so you can get away with stuff that wouldn't fly if you were actually talking to someone who would properly be critical of you.
Yeah, another
Mm.
example might be that death by phantasm in the Brenda Bowser episode. There's in the local ecology, there were groups of people from different areas all coming together to decide how a horrendous murder what happened, and the elders decided it was death by phantasm, and
Mm.
presumably they all agreed, and other people agreed, and that was an argument of well, it's going to be high cost to like pin this on somebody and the retaliatory cost. So all individual minds are sort of thinking it's not worth the cost to like pin this on somebody. And so the evaluation of phantasm being plausible or not has nothing to do with whether or not a phantasm exists per se, but it's sort of like, do I agree with this for these other reasons, right?
Yeah, because I mean, when we think, I mean, so I mean, obviously you're right, David, that the justifications we give, I mean, their function is to make us look good. So we're gonna, if we have a choice of different motives that we can pick as a reason, we're gonna try to pick the one that makes us look better. But let's say I hadn't showed up today to the podcast, and you asked me, so why didn't you log in? And I say, well, I was saving a child's life somehow.
Hmm.
Either you ask me for some details, what the hell happened, but you're not going just to take my word for it, like it's gonna look weird, even though it's maybe the excuse I could give that could,
I
make me
I
look
probably
better.
would take your word for it.
I would do.
Honestly, no, it's interesting that you bring up that example because I probably would take your word for it because if I did challenge your account, I would look hostile to you. You
Yeah, no,
know,
no, fair enough, but
I would look like
it's
I don't trust you.
plausible.
Yeah.
It's plausible that
Yeah.
you would find out at some point, or there was, I can't, if like
Yeah.
because you're on the other side of the world, it might fly, but if
Mhm.
I were to say that to my coworkers, like, how did you like what happened, and then you have to make stuff up that's complicated, and you get caught in a lie, and then you look really, really bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
um and so in that case it's a bit extreme because it's a complete lie. But even if someone who is always late, and
Hmm.
they always say, oh, it's because I missed my train, blah blah blah, if you know that person, it's bullshit. Like, it's
Yeah.
just that they're bad at keeping time, and then they don't
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
care about some meetings. And
Hmm.
so maybe, as you were saying, socially, you're not going to challenge them, but you're still judging them as they should
Yeah.
be judged.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a great point. So if I could summarize the take, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, um, yes, we all have an incentive to kind of bullshit about the reasons why we do things, to confabulate. Um, but usually people are pretty skeptical and pretty vigilant against this kind of bullshitting, and that forces us to come up with a reasonably compelling justification for why we did things. Because if it was too crazy and too implausible, people wouldn't believe us and they would judge us, and we would have reputational costs.
It would be worse,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
it would be worse. But in some cases, when everyone has the same biases or the same interests to come up with a particular justification. So, for example, in the case of the Brenda Bowser episodes, when everyone has a reason to not create a cycle of violence, and everyone has a reason to maybe pin this on a phantasm, then you can get a kind of cooperative bullshitting where everyone is trying to tell a story that justifies a particular course of action that everyone has an interest in pursuing. And you can get this in political groups as well, where you get a kind of cooperative bullshitting where we come up with a story that justifies the agenda of our group. Maybe we spin a utopian narrative that if we pursue this objective, it's going to create a utopia on Earth, and therefore it's worthwhile. And that would be a different mechanism for this kind of stuff.
Yes, no, no, completely. And these
Yeah.
kind of cultural productions um, are very interesting. But as a rule, given the mechanism that generates them, they're not really causally efficacious. Like, if people want to do something in the first place, and then they're going to, confabulate some justification that everybody is happy to accept.
Hmm.
But it's the justification isn't why they're doing it. Like, it's not as if,
Yes.
people were like, at some point someone convinces them that witches exist, and then they start seeing witches everywhere. It's like they're happy to believe that witches exist to a large extent.
Hmm.
And so then they're happy to accept the theory, sort of, that they do exist.
Yeah.
Right. Because they all have a common interest in not being the one burned at the stake. And because they are all biased in that direction to not themselves be the witches, then they are happy to accept the reason why someone else is a witch.
Yeah, actually, in that case in particular, I mean, we're kind of, it's a bit of a tangent, but Pascal Boyer has this interesting theory that a lot of these beliefs, like, if you're in most societies in which people cooperate to some extent, so in essentially all societies, um, there's some informal burden to help people who suffer misfortunes. Like, it's not clear
Hmm.
exactly who the burden falls on and how large the burden should be. But even if in our societies, if something really bad happens to your neighbor, you feel as if maybe you should do something to help. And it's not clear who should help and how much everybody should help. And so it's not a great situation to be in. And most people are happy to try to minimize the how much it is perceived that they should help. And if you say either, well, that person had a misfortune because they violated a taboo, so then it's their fault. So no one really has to help because they brought it on themselves. Or it's that guy who bewitched them, or cast a spell or whatever. Then that guy has to pay reparation. And so I don't have to do anything either. And
Hmm.
what's nice with this is that Actually, in most societies, witches are not punished. Like, say, oh no, he's the witch, it's his fault. And then the guy has to apologize and do, maybe help a bit the guy who suffered the misfortune. But the punishment is really not commensurate with the accusation, like we know with the thing that the person is accused of. So just everybody is happy to have, someone that they can put pin the blame on. And then once they have that, they don't really want to punish the person because that's not the point. The point is just to so that everybody knows I'm not the one who has to help the guy who suffered the misfortune.
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah, in that case, the motive would be none of us want to actually pitch in to help this guy, and this narrative helps us force someone else to help the guy. Yeah.
Yeah, and justify our not helping them
Yeah.
or not helping
It's
them
interesting.
too much anyway.
It really
Hmm.
sounds like, I mean, even in that example, like sort of words are really pretty minimally effective in the following sense of like, we're saying somebody caused their misfortune, and that's just to prevent other people from sort of saying, I should do something. Um, but then if you take seriously that this person caused the misfortune, the behavior should be, we should really do something, but then people
Hmm.
don't want to do
Hmm.
that. So I mean, it's a real clear case of there's sort of an asymmetry with use of words even, that it's sort of coalitional in the sense of it's sort of defensive words are sort of produced, but then when it's sort of offensive and it's like, well, this involves having to actually do something, everyone's like, oh, whatever, we'll just kind of let that slide.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There's
Do,
a
do you,
just oh, sorry, David, go ahead. Yeah.
so just one interesting thought that just occurred to me. Do you think um, the inability of us to detect our own biases is itself a design feature of this system? So you could imagine a system where we're in the middle of a witch hunt, and I'm perfectly aware that the only reason I'm accusing this person of witchcraft is to get him to help out and not me. If I'm aware of that, and maybe I'm explicit about that, well, that's going to really lower my chances of successfully accusing that guy of witchcraft if I say, oh, I'm only doing this because I don't want to help. And so, could it be that this inability to detect the underlying motivations of our arguments, our underlying biases, is itself a design feature, and that if we were aware of them, perhaps it might leak out and it might make our arguments less convincing. If I'm in the middle of an argument with you and I am explicit about my biases and my underlying agenda, that's going to make you more vigilant and that's going to make you trust me less. So I have an incentive to try to frame my argument, my arguing and reasoning as a kind of disinterested, dispassionate truth seeking to increase the chances that you'll actually accept my arguments. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need anything specifically designed to not do something that is cognitively tremendously hard in the first place. You just, there's no pressure for that mechanism you're describing to evolve. And so it doesn't evolve. You don't need specific pressure for it not to evolve in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yes.
it's a very complex cognitive machinery. You need a
Right.
lot of positive pressure for the thing to evolve in the first place. So its absence doesn't need an explanation beyond
Got it.
that in a way.
Yes.
Um, yeah, but because you could also have imagined that it would be obviously like we have cognitive mechanisms that allow us to understand people's motives, like we have theory of mind. So because it's really important for us to understand other people's motives, and you'd think we'd be more keen on turning them to ourselves, onto ourselves, and we're not doing it that much, which suggests that it's a lot of it is a problem of motivation. Like it's not something that evolutionarily would have helped people to better understand themselves because you're supposed to already your brain is wired to do the things that are good for you in the first place. So understanding it isn't going to help you by default.
And
Hmm.
just as a throwback or callback to another episode with depression and Ed Hagen, I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but with the one area where people don't have confirmation biases as much is people who are depressed, right? And the argument is that's a design feature for essentially arguing that, well, however, whatever settings we have in this brain are not working, and we really need to evaluate things more objectively than the settings in this thing, in the current body envelope. And so that's one area where you actually do get sort of quote unquote less biased reasoning. Is that
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know to what extent they would have less of this specific bias I have been describing in the sense that, for instance, the bias, this is my side bias or confirmation bias. if I give you, psychologists have a lot of these logical problems that tend to be tricky. So the typical one is the bat and ball. So like a bat and a ball cost $1.10 together. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Most people say 10 cents. The correct answer is 5 cents. And um, and when you give people that kind of problems, it's one of the also very clean demonstration of a confirmation bias, because you give them the problem, immediately they think that 10 cents is the correct answer. And then if through eye tracking, think about protocols, whatever else, you figure out what people are thinking after they have had that initial intuition, overwhelmingly they're looking for reasons why they're right. So they have this confirmation bias. And I think that whether you're depressed or super happy, you is going to be exactly the same. People who are depressed are not going to start thinking, oh, maybe I'm completely wrong. What about 5 cents, or what about some other answer? So, I mean, obviously, the differences that Ed Hagen was talking about are real, but I don't think they would affect that particular bias. It's more generally, how optimistic, or how able to kind of self-inflate you are, rather than this specific mechanism.
Right. Or, I mean, or what, I mean, I think the argument, and for the people who argue that it happens, is sort of, if we're having a conversation and we're arguing who's right, I'm just more likely, if I'm depressed, to sort of think I'm less correct, right? I mean, these are just individual differences, right?
Yeah, no, possibly. I mean, you want to like, so there are, when we talk about reasoning, for us, there are two main functions. One is to exchange arguments because we want to change someone's mind about a given conclusion. Like, let's say we want to go for dinner together and we disagree about which restaurant to go to, and we might exchange arguments as to, where we should be going. And the other function is to justify ourselves. So, if I've done something that you think might be stupid, or I've picked a restaurant that you think was really bad, then I'm just trying to justify and defend myself. And a lot of the discussions we have, even though it feels like in theory they're about conviction, like they're about what is true, like when you talk about politics, when you talk about culture, when you talk about a lot of these things, because the conclusions don't affect us at all in our behavior. I think they're mostly actually about reputation. So a lot of it, when we talk about these things, it's a way of showing that we have coherent opinions, that we're well informed, that we have moral opinions. And so if you are less motivated to show people that you're smart and that you're more, a good person, etc., because you are depressed, then you're going to give up more easily. But if it's something that affects you more directly in terms of a decision that you have to make, then maybe the difference may be less between someone who is depressed. But I just don't know enough about depression.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah, and I mean,
maybe my intuition.
getting off the depression thing, because this is a really subtle point, and I think I just want to make sure that I've got it. So what you've talked about is sort of people hold views, and there's good reasons, or there's at least software reasons, evolved software reasons why people hold views or opinions or behave the way they do. And that is sort of silent machinery that's calculating what we've basically characterized as like individual interest, or like extended
Hmm.
individual interest. So view is the one element. The other element is confabulation. So confabulation is sort of a narrative about why this view exists. And what I'm hearing from you is that a lot of conversation and reasoning is about coordinating confabulation, right? So it's sort of like, so let's use the example of the podcast. So David and I are like, let's have a podcast, right? Having the podcast, and the idea of having the podcast is sort of the view. But then everything we talk about is sort of, if I said, well, let's have a podcast because, the sky is purple, David would be like, well, that's a bad reason. That doesn't make any
Hmm.
sense. And why he's doing that is because if we tell other people that, he's going to realize, well, that's just a bad reason. And people are going to be like, well, that's a stupid reason. You shouldn't have a podcast. It's not a good justification for him doing it,
Hmm.
for telling his wife why he's spending time, or like or himself why he's spending time doing it. Um, but maybe we say, well, we want to like inform people, right? And now that doesn't include all the reasons why we're doing it. It might not even include the primary reasons why we're doing it. So the view is sort of hidden from us, but he's still selecting among the confabulations that sort of work for the function of the confabulation, which is sort of to have a good reason, a good enough reason, even if it doesn't exhaust all the reasons for the view. So in this
Yeah,
view, the view and the confabulation are very different sort of games in a way. Is that a fair characterization?
yeah, no, no, it is, but What matters, I guess, in these things is who the audience is. So if you and David are brainstorming justifications for the podcast, essentially you're both of you want to do a podcast. So you're just anticipating in the same way that if you on your own, Dave, had wanted to do a podcast, you could think on your own, say, what am I going to tell my wife? What am I going to, tell other people? And so you can do that on your own, and we do that a lot. Like we spend a lot of our time anticipating potential disagreement or judge or negative judgments, and anticipate what we would say. And you can also do that in groups, if it's a collective decision. But sometimes you're just, you're talking with David or with someone else, and you're just disagreeing over something, and then you're trying to justify your views to that person because they happen to be disagreeing. And I still think that latter thing is the most common in the sense that when you're in a social setting and you realize that someone disagrees with you, you have a natural, like it's very spontaneously you'll think of arguments for why you're right, or justifications for your views. Whereas when you haven't been exposed yet to someone disagreeing, you know, we don't find, most of the decisions we make, we don't struggle for justifications. We just, if I bought this brand of cereal, I just bought this brand of cereal. No one's going to bother me about it. Um, so it's only when you anticipate having this potentially negative feedback that you start looking for it, and you don't always anticipate having such feedback. I mean, fortunately.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really interesting, complicated thing. I mean, I'm thinking also, like, for example, like, let's imagine somebody who's like cartoonishly racist, right? Like a Nazi or somebody,
Hmm.
or it's like a white supremacist. And there's sort of this classic idea that sort of like they might have views or like confabulation for holding their view. But then if you take the example of somebody who changes their mind and they're no longer a Nazi or a white supremacist, it's often they just have the experience of, of people being everywhere the same, right? But that wasn't the
Hmm.
part of the confabulation. And so they'll even have a confabulation for sort of why they've changed their view. But in fact, the deep reason why they were prejudiced or racist in the first place was sort of overridden by cues, but it was never part of the verbal narrative, right? It's just like they just have a different experience. So again, I think it comes back to that's another example where really the real reasons why we're doing things and then the verbal narratives are sort of really two different independent streams almost.
Yes, I mean, then again, I mean, as we were saying earlier, they can't be completely detached. I mean, at least, as long as you get some social feedback, like if you're just completely in your head and you don't talk about that specific justification to anybody, you can really kind of go off on a tangent, I guess. But as a rule, as we were saying, if you veer too far off of something that's, a bit like the truth,
Yeah.
you're going to have issues. But I mean, we think of it, we're talking about it as if it's a bad thing, but that's also what you get, for instance, in mathematics. Like people have an intuition that a given conjecture is right, and then they work really, really hard on finding a theorem, and then they have the theorem, and then, the reason why they know then that the conjecture was actually correct. Sorry, they have the proof. Sorry, not the theorem. They have the proof. So
Right.
they work very hard on the proof. And the reason why they thought the conjecture was correct was their intuition, their mathematical intuition that it would be correct. But then they have the proof that gives them the reason why it is actually, or a reason. There can be several proofs why it is actually correct, and it's not bad, in any normative sense. It's just the way kind of things are.
Yeah, no, I think all scientists have that. And I'll stop in a second, but I just want to push on this because I think it's a really subtle, important thing. And there is a tension of like that confabulation track and the view track. They do have some correspondence. So like in the racist example, like let's say that the white supremacist is sort of like actually, people who look different from me they're actually good, hardworking people, right? And that idea, that narrative of like good and hardworking, like what that's not, but if that
Hmm.
is sort of an accepted thing by somebody else, then that is sort of approved, right? But if that white supremacist says that to like one of the other white supremacists who doesn't want that, they'll say, no, I don't agree with that. Now,
Hmm.
why they're against that group of people has nothing to do with hard work, how hardworking it is. So, but it's sort of acceptance or rejection of the confabulation is the correspondence on behavior is just it's a cue of whether or not are we going to continue this behavior or change our behavior, right? So it's like kids on the playground where they're like, Sally thinks the purple ball is the best thing, and she's wrong. She's stupid, right? That's the purple
Mhm.
ball sucks. We don't care about the purple ball. The reason why we care about talking about the purple ball is what we're going to do to Sally. So I think just to push on this idea that they do have correspondence, the confabulation and the view or the behavior, but it's one that's a linked one, right? Because it has to have something. Like if you say something crazy and it has no mapping onto like, well, what real thing are you going to do as a result of this belief or value? I might go looking for that, but I think, but it can still be indirect. Is that, I
Yeah, no,
realize
no,
this
that's
is kind of a
completely right.
subtle
I mean,
point, but yeah,
like for instance, whenever there are ethnic riots and ethnic groups kind of fight each other, it's always preceded by rumors that the other ethnic groups, the one that is going to be attacked, has committed some atrocity. They've poisoned the wells, they've raped women, they've killed children, and so these things they're not completely implausible. Like, people do that in some cases, and they're clearly in the morally right direction. Like, it's bad to, poison wells, etc. So it's just that because we're all looking for a justification, we're willing to suspend belief a little bit, like something that's, not super plausible, we're going to accept because we're all happy to do this. But it still has to be a morally valid argument and a premise that's it can be a little bit it can be far-fetched to some extent, but given people's prior beliefs, it has to be somewhat coherent with that.
yeah, yeah,
I have another interesting thought here. So we're talking about, when confabulations work in justifying a behavior and when they don't. So if I give a confabulation that's wildly implausible for my behavior, like, the sky is purple, that's not going to work. If I give a confabulation that's more plausible and defensible, that might work. But there's a third option that I want to explore with you and get your take on. I can give a confabulation that is so vague or unfalsifiable or unverifiable that you don't really know if it's correct, or you would have no way of going about figuring out whether it was correct or not. And it would be really hard for you to coordinate with other people to, prove it as incorrect. So if I say, I started this podcast because it was fulfilling, it made me happy, there's really no way you can verify that claim. And that may well be a design feature, and that may well explain why we justify so many of our behaviors in terms of this underlying. I did it because it made me feel happy, it made me feel fulfilled, it was rewarding, it was meaningful. I'm just pursuing it helped me express my authentic self. These kinds of narratives are very hard to falsify, and they're so vague. It's kind of hard to know what they even mean exactly. But
Yes.
and so that could be a third route where if we don't have a plausible sounding justification that serves the social uh, goal, we may start reaching for things that are just hard to verify. And that may
Yes.
well explain why sometimes our confabulations extend into supernatural domains like witchcraft or spirits, because those domains are, by their very nature, hard to falsify and verify. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, no, completely, but it only works for things that people want to believe in the first place. Like,
Right.
if you want to convince Dave that you should be doing a podcast and the two of you want to do a podcast, it's always going to be fulfilling, you're very happy with this, it's great.
Mhm.
But if you want to convince someone who doesn't really want to do a podcast with you and you tell them, oh, it's going to be fulfilling, and they're like, what? So,
Yeah.
it's going to work to the extent that you don't have to actually convince anybody. It's like if you need some kind of placeholder to say, well, that sounds okay, and we're just all
Mhm.
happy to have something, this
Yeah.
as a place we can point at as a justification.
Hmm.
But if your wife is thinking, well, this is a really stupid decision, you need to do something that is more productive, whatever, and you tell her, well, no, but it's fulfilling. It's like, well, it doesn't really pay the bills. So it depends on what your goal is. Like if the goal is just to create this common narrative that maybe at some point we could present to others, or we can just point at, because in many cases people, they're not going to be, if I'm like a friend of yours, like, well, you do whatever you want anyway, so it's like, whatever. um but if you want to actually convince someone who has a stake, um it's not gonna cut it. And it's
Hmm.
true as well for not only convincing, like, let's say, someone to do a podcast, but if I think that doing podcast as a rule is like a waste of your time, and I think that because you're doing a podcast, you're being a bit silly, you telling me this isn't going to change my mind at all about the quality of your decision making. So, it can explain why these things exist culturally when you have a lot of people who want to have a justification for something they want to do in the first place. But the prediction would be that they're not going to be convincing to anybody who doesn't really agree with that in the first, who do agree with the decision to start with.
Right. That makes sense. So if we all share, the religious belief, for example, and we all want to justify this religious belief for whatever reason, then those kinds of religious justifications will work on us. But when it comes to persuading other people that our God, wants X, Y, Z, it's not going to be convincing to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that explains why. I mean, people are like, oh, other people believe really weird stuff. It's a consequence of it's in their interest to have a narrative for why they're doing what they're doing. And when you experience you're outside of that group of people who that benefit network, then you would just have this. This is a prediction of the theory, is that the reasons for people doing things will look weird to the extent that you are outside of the network of benefit from that network, to the extent that there's confabulation around why people are doing what they're doing.
Yes, they're going to look weak because in a way they haven't really passed the test of being being really criticized or evaluated by someone who disagrees with them. And so yeah, I mean it's and that's the first thing we do. Like whenever you think about something, you're anticipating a disagreement or even you're in a discussion, the first arguments that will pop into your mind will typically be relatively weak. They won't be terrible, like again, not no one is gonna say because the sky is purple, but they're gonna be great. Like, if let's say we disagree about whether we should go to the restaurant or which restaurant we should go to, and you tell me, oh, we should go there, it's a great restaurant. It's not a very good argument. Like obviously if you're saying that we should go there, you think it's a good restaurant, but it's fine. And in a conversational context, it makes sense to do it that way in the sense that if I have weak preferences and that's enough to convince me because I don't really care, then great. And if I disagree with you, I'm going to tell you why I disagree, why I think that restaurant is bad or that other restaurant is better, and then you can address that specific argument. And so in a dialogic setting, it makes a lot of sense to be quite lazy about the justifications or the arguments we produce. And it's only when we get pushback that we have to produce better stuff. And if you never get the pushback, then you stick with the stuff that's a bit lazy.
So it sounds like, I mean, this is an argument that argument is a good thing to the extent that we want social institutions to produce accurate or rational or actually beneficial beliefs or behaviors that, I mean, I think this is like an argument for science, right? Is that falsifiability, like from a Popper perspective, or just arguing for different theories, that the things develop out of argument, out of disagreement.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, you absolutely need disagreement to sharpen your arguments. That's how the quality of arguments increases. That's how you force people to have better data. I mean, if you take something like the history of clinical trials, in a way, the way clinical trials are run now is the outcome of a long history of arguments of someone saying, well, if you just give the drug to one guy and you see whether it works, it's not, we don't know whether it works because, you need, maybe the guy just got better of his own accord. And then you have a control group say, well, but maybe it's chance. I mean, you don't have enough people, so then you have more people, and then you need the groups to be matched. And it's just an extended argument. That means that at the end, you can have something that you're reasonably sure of because you've increased the quality of the argument throughout this process of kind of protracted argumentation.
And is that what reasoning is? I mean, because I think as evolutionary psychologists, we don't think reasoning is a natural category in the mind in the sense of like my visual system is reasoning about where you are, right? In the scene, we don't really think of that in a folk psychological perspective as reasoning. Is the folk category reasoning? I think the reality of this folk category is the third is a third person representation, right? Or it is a real representation. It's not a real category of actual scientific processing. It's like, but is what is reasoning coherently? Is it this process of anticipating arguments and finding counter arguments, or how do you think about what the category
Yes,
of
no, no,
reasoning is
exactly.
there?
So you're completely right. Like for us, we differentiate between inference in the broad term, which is what a lot of people just call reasoning,
Right.
and which becomes a little bit counterintuitive because, as you were saying, your low-level visual processes perform inferences. Maybe your retina performs inferences, and so it just becomes a bit weird to call that reasoning, just because that's not how we typically use the term. But it doesn't matter. It's all just kind of semantics. The reality we believe or we suggest is that you have many inferential mechanisms. You have many of these mechanisms that are dedicated to a given task. And one of these mechanisms, its task happens to be finding and evaluating reasons. It's a very specific task, and you can imagine, and you have people who can talk, and they have syntax, they have semantics, they have pragmatics, they can discuss things. But in theory, you could take out this reasoning ability, and they couldn't really understand arguments. They couldn't really, they would be really bad at it. Like, because if I have a given view and I want to convince you of it, you need a mechanism that will give you that. Like, it's really hard to find a good argument. Like, even if you take a given thought, of all the things that are kind of in the semantic space of that thought, the things that might be possibly relevant, many of them aren't going to be good arguments. And so finding a good argument is just a cognitively or kind of computationally very hard task for which you need, if you want to do it well, you need dedicated machinery. Like, obviously there's some kind of bootstrapping problem, and at some point you can imagine that some of the using more general kind of mind reading or pragmatic abilities, you can get some of the way. But then, because it's something we do a lot and we have a stake at kind of being good at, presumably specific mechanisms would have evolved that just help us find and evaluate arguments in particular and reasons in particular.
Right. And just as the example that David talked about with the podcast, sort of like fulfilling, right? That software would presumably sort of generate that as a candidate, sort of say, well, this would be good defensively for me, but it wouldn't convince my wife. It wouldn't convince a skeptic. There might be other things like, oh, spread science that might convince my wife, that might convince a skeptic. And so the software is sort of churning candidates, calculating how will this be received to somebody who's on my side against me. And then the filter is sort of evaluating to what extent is it likely that the people who already agree with me are going to be the bottleneck for me actually doing this. So that would be the kind of machine you're talking about.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's just that it's a mechanism that uses a lot of social feedback at different scales. So the first at the very kind of local scale, as I was saying earlier, typically you start with some argument that is like it is a good, well-formed argument that makes sense, but it doesn't have to be super, super strong. And then you bounce off of what the other person is saying and disagreeing and why they're disagreeing with you. And so that you have this very kind of live improvement in reasoning. But then you also learn through experience. So, if you have, two children like two siblings are arguing over the toy, and the mother said, but, what are you doing? And one says, but I want it. And say, well, but your brother also wants it.
Yeah.
And so then the next time they, well, I can't just say I want it because it's not a good argument. That's the first thing that pops into their mind.
Yeah.
But then they say, well, I have to say, well, actually, I had it first, or, he had it earlier, blah, blah, blah. And so that's what happens to us as academics. Like, you submit a paper and you get knocked down by a reviewer two because of blah blah blah. And the next time you try to anticipate, and it's something that we're good at learning to do,
Mm.
but it's really hard to anticipate. It's not natural to have to really anticipate. You're just good at integrating social feedback rather than anticipating it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think even like good teachers or like the kids example or comedians very explicitly will talk about when you shop material. And David maybe even
Yeah.
has experience, right? Of you got to at some point you just throw stuff out in the world and see how people respond. But then there's this machinery that's really efficient, effective at changing what you do in response to the feedback.
Yes.
Yeah, no, this particular justification or reasoning, this worked particularly well. Give positively reinforce that, come up with those types of reasons again in the future, and you get this kind of learning of how to effectively reason or justify. I want to
Sorry, I'm so sorry, David.
yeah.
Just because I want to bounce off of something there.
Mhm.
It's really because it's true for all the things that we do well, like, vision, language. We think it's
Yeah.
easy because we're so good at it.
Oh
Yeah.
yes.
And I think
Yes.
it looks like obviously we find reasons. It's super easy, but it's really hard. And there's this example I love with one of my kids who said once, he was very small, he didn't want to go to bed. He said, "Oh, I don't want to go to bed because I'm too tired." And obviously that
I've been
doesn't
there
work.
before. I have
But
been there before.
but he had
That's actually a
learned
good
like the
reason sometimes.
general, like, it's exactly like, when a child says, I run, when you
Yeah,
overgeneralize, it is the
overregulated.
same.
Yeah,
Like, you
yeah, yeah, yeah,
learn, okay,
yeah.
so I can say I'm too tired to as a reason for not doing something. Like, he would never say, I want the blue toy because I'm too tired. That doesn't make sense. He would never have said
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
But the general form of the argument, an action that I don't want to do, I can use I'm too tired as a reason. It just happens this one doesn't work.
Mm,
But you can see he to because I also obviously had never encountered that argument in his environment. No one had ever said that to him.
yeah.
And so that meant that when people had told him, I don't want to do that because I'm too tired, or when he had tried that in another context, he had generalized that
Yes.
there's this thing that I can say, well, action I don't want to do, I can say I'm too tired. And then he had overgeneralized to the one situation in which it does, or one of the few
Yeah.
situations in which it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so sorry, David.
Yeah, and that's a great, just to also interrupt David, that's a great, just go off of Hugo here. That's a great example of why something like reinforcement learning and just learning in
Yeah.
general is not opposed to a very domain specific, lots of computational machinery for an evolved
Yes.
function. It's that
Yes.
that kind of learning only works within this very narrow, already pre-specified scope of exactly as you said, there's these category slots for things like, state that's negative, excuse,
Yeah.
thing I don't want to do, and then it's within that something like reinforcement learning can sort of operate, where if it's
Mhm.
unconstrained it just
Yes.
wouldn't do anything. So great,
Yeah.
Yeah.
great.
That's a great point. No, it's a beautiful example of this. Reinforcement learning isn't just a magic wand you
Yeah,
can wave that solves any computational problem that you have. The system has to know what to reinforce and how specific or general the thing is. Am I reinforcing I'm too tired in general as an all-purpose excuse? Am I only reinforcing that in a specific context? How specific is the context? The system needs to be able to solve these problems, and in order to do that, you need some functional specialization. So it's a great point. So I want to push back a little bit on the social interactionist reasoning. I want to sort of play the role of a critic, and give you a situation where it seems like what reasoning is doing is a purely solitary rational process. So if I'm playing chess with you, I might, think through all the different possible moves you might make. Well, if I make this move, then he'll make this counter move, and that's bad. But if I make this move and then this move and then this move and then this move, well, he's going to be really screwed if I do that. I'll be able to fork him in this interesting way. So maybe that's the best move path to take. So it seems like when I'm doing that kind of reasoning, this kind of chess style reasoning, or we could even put this in terms of like social chess is an expression that people use when they're social strategizing with one another, trying to outfox each other. It seems like in that context, it really is serving an individual decision-making function. The more I spend time, reasoning through the different moves, the better move I'm going to make most of the time. And it doesn't seem like I need to actually verbally tell anyone why I made that move. Maybe I'll never tell anyone why I made that move, or I'll never have to justify it to anyone. I mean, it doesn't seem like I need to convince anyone that that's the right path for me to take. It's purely happening inside my head, and it seems like the purpose that it's serving is to help me make a better move. And so in that case, I kind of want to say that, yeah, reasoning is serving this kind of folk function of helping me make personal, better decisions. So what would you say to something like that? Is there room for reasoning to serve this kind of function,
So
or
the way we would address that is just to say that it's not reasoning. Like it's
hmm,
just a different cognitive, like we call that reasoning because we're using kind of folk categories. But the cognitive mechanism that you're using to anticipate what your opponent would do at chess, or to take these kind of strategic decisions are just different from the mechanisms that allow us to find and evaluate reasons.
hmm,
So we call that reasoning because introspectively we have the same kind of feeling of effort, or kind of that we're going through possibilities, um, but we don't think we're reasoning in the more narrow sense that we're using in terms of really kind of thinking through reasons. And it's a subtle difference, and clearly it's important to draw it. So it's good you drew the attention to that, because we're not saying that this kind of inferential process, however we call it strategic reasoning or strategic or something, that it's not efficient or that people aren't good at it. And it is indeed, you would expect this sort of things to be purely individual, because it has a more, in a way, kind of Machiavellian function
hmm,
rather than reasoning, which works because you're exchanging reasons with others.
okay.
yeah,
So that would be some kind of like strategic inferences or something like that, or I would, or maybe like counterfactual thinking or something like that. Uh,
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
and just to follow up on that, like for the in my paper on difference detecting mechanisms, which I'm late on the revisions for, so
Mhm.
but should be coming out any moment now. One of the arguments for why there's thinking is a category is for, and this is sort of related to reasoning, and I think these may be being used interchangeably, is there needs to be a placeholder for I'm still processing or you're still processing, and you haven't arrived yet at a representation or decision. So, for example, if somebody's like David's like, well, what do you want to have for lunch today? And there needs to be software in me for representing, have I gone through the process of arriving at an answer to David yet? And if that system detects, no, I'm still calculating costs and benefits, I will say, well, I'm thinking about it. I need a minute. And so there's sort of a representation of there can be a delay in an organism at arriving at a thing it wants to do because it takes some time to process stuff. And the same reason, like, why isn't David moving right now? Well, it's because or why isn't he talking? He's thinking about what to say, right? So that's a broader category than reasoning in this precise Mercier sense, if that sort
Yeah,
of
yeah, no,
adds to
completely.
the
No,
answer.
that's
Yeah.
very, yeah, no, that's a great point. And indeed, it does make sense that we would have such an intuitive category because it's really useful in everyday life to be able to talk about it. So I can't help but insert a cute anecdote that
Please.
Dan Sperber, my advisor and co-author on all of this work, recounts that when he was, so his father was also an intellectual. And when he was a child, he would play around, and his father would be sitting on his armchair, with his eyes closed, doing nothing, and his mother would tell him, don't bother your father, he's working. And as a child, it's not intuitive that it's thinking can be a form of work that's kind of efficacious.
Exactly. Yeah. To pivot a little bit, and this may be a segue, is so we've talked about people's views being pretty good, or behaviors. There being good reasons for that, but then the confabulation sort of being confabulation, right? And just good enough to sort of serve the needs of satisfying or convincing others. You have other work that's about not being gullible, like not born yesterday, that people hold good, maybe beliefs is the oversimplified version of that. I'm sort of wondering if you can connect what we've just been talking about now to this other idea of yours that I think has been controversial, and you can maybe tell us more about this, or maybe even more clearly what the claim is, because the idea that sort of people are not gullible and hold good beliefs, justified beliefs. Maybe this isn't the claim, but that's sort of, I think, how people understand it. It's sort of even it's slightly inconsistent even in what we've been talking about, which is that like people's behaviors and their views they might hold for good evolved reasons, quote unquote, but then the confabulations, it's satisfying or like it's good for science are sort of just will-o-wisp, maybe not very good. How do you square that distinction with this other body of work that's about people are really good at holding beliefs and hold beliefs that are sort of good for them?
No, that's a great question. So the point I've been making in that book, and that also kind of Dan and a bunch of colleagues have been making in a paper called Epistemic Vigilance, is that people have to have mechanisms to evaluate communicated information because we can't just take each other's word for it because we have conflicting, or to some extent, we have non-perfectly overlapping incentives and interests. So even when people close to you tell you something, you can't just accept that it's going to be in your best interest to accept it. Um, and so we have to have cognitive mechanisms that allow us to evaluate what other people are telling us and what they're communicating to us. And I think that really applies, as we are saying, and that's why I was pushing back a bit at the beginning on David's point that people can just make stuff up. So people can make stuff up, but other people, if they disagree with in the first place, they will evaluate that critically. And the exception to that, in a way, is when you agree with the conclusion that people want to have a confabulation or justification for, and then you're happy to have one as well. And
Mm,
so, if you're one of the people who is happy to have a scapegoat who
right.
will be accused of making someone suffer misfortune, you're happy to have this justification that actually, that guy is a witch, and to have this whole belief system. So you become much more, I mean, gullible is the wrong term, but because it's kind of smart of you to accept these things, but you become more kind of laxer in your criteria when you already accept the conclusion. And it's true for, in general, if you accept a given conclusion, um, you don't really care about the arguments because the arguments are not going to make you change your mind. They're just there that you could potentially reuse to try to convince other people. So so these two things are quite coherent, but it's also important then to stress that when you do disagree, then you'll be much more critical.
Mm.
And so yeah, I mean, when you're the ethnographer and especially kind of in earlier periods, and you arrive in these people and they believe in witches, you're like, well, no, obviously there are no witches. You're not all of a sudden convinced that there are witches. So these justifications only convince the people who have a motivation to believe in them in the first place.
Yeah. And then the disagreement, or so that argument has this claim of, the not born yesterday idea or the epistemic vigilance, has it been misunderstood? Do people think you're making a broader claim, or in what way has it been misunderstood or taken too far?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure because I'm taking it far enough. I'm not sure how much people have tried to take it further.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't mean to say that people are never wrong because obviously they are sometimes. The point I'm trying to make is that when people are wrong, usually it's not because of communication. Usually it's because their priors are wrong. So if you ask people, if you go to a small scale society and you ask them what is the shape of the earth, and maybe mostly they're not gonna know, but maybe they're gonna tell you some weird narrative or that it's flat essentially because that's what they're saying. It's not because they've been brainwashed into thinking that. It's just because that's either what their senses are telling them, or because they have a story that allows them to justify something that's important to them. So it's not people are they have obviously they are wrong about some things, but it's rare that mass communication or communication more generally is the cause of these mistaken beliefs. Like it can, or I mean, to take another example, like you know obviously if you grew up in a specific small scale society and you have really specific religious beliefs and you believe that this ancestor does that to these people for that reason, this is heavily shaped by communication because the name of the ancestor, the specific form that they take is specific to your culture. So in the same way as when you grew up speaking English, it's because you had English speaking peers and parents. But the fact that everybody speaks a language is, the fact that everybody in small scale society and to some extent in other societies believes in these kind of supernatural entities, it suggests that even if the specific details of any one of them is due to communication, the broad form is there because people are pre-wired to believe in this sort of thing. So their priors for this sort of things existing, or their incentives for believing in this sort of things are very high to start with. And the culture gives you the specifics rather than the more fundamental idea.
Mm. Interesting.
So I want to so there's a wonderful key distinction you make in Not Born Yesterday that helps you make sense of our epistemic vigilance or our skepticism toward communicated information on the one hand, and the seemingly wide variety of wacky beliefs that humans seem to fall prey to. And the distinction you make is between intuitive beliefs and reflective beliefs. So intuitive beliefs are the ones that are often they actually guide our behavior in a real concrete sense. So I intuitively believe that there's a coffee cup on the table, so I'm going to reach in that direction to pick up the coffee cup. My belief about where the coffee cup is directly connected to my nervous system such that I reach in a particular direction. And that's an intuitive belief. And then there's this different category called reflective belief that doesn't really guide my behavior in the same way. It's kind of functionally inert. And your argument, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that a lot of these seemingly wacky beliefs are not actually intuitive beliefs. They're not actually guiding people's behavior in a concrete way. They're just kind of reflective beliefs that they're serving social functions, and people don't really believe them deep down in a way that is actually guiding their behavior. So could you flesh out this idea of what this difference is between intuitive and reflective, why the mind should be divided up in this way, and how we figure out whether to adopt something as an intuitive belief versus a reflective belief.
Thanks. That's a great question. The first thing I'd say is all of that comes from Dan Nicod. He has a wonderful paper called Intuitive and Reflexive Belief. So all of
Mm-hmm.
this framework is really kind of his ideas, Dan's forever.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so by an illustration I like is the contrast between people who have actual experiences of conspiracies and conspiracy theorists, people
Mm-hmm.
who believe in conspiracy theories. And everything we know about people who have actually witnessed a conspiracy. So you've seen your boss shredding documents that are very compromising. You've seen someone in your company do something bad. You've seen someone in government do something extremely fishy. And the behavior of these people is consistently to be afraid, it's really hard to tell people who would be kind of whistleblowers to reveal their secrets.
Mm-hmm.
They're afraid for their jobs. If you're in a bad country, you can be afraid for your life. You're afraid to jeopardize your social relationships if you say anything. And so most people's reactions is to be, first of all, to be really scared. It's very strong emotionally. And then it's really hard. You don't say anything as a rule. And that's the exact opposite of what most people who endorse conspiracy theories feel. Like they're not, even if they believe that the CIA is powerful enough to pull off 9/11, they're not afraid they're going to say that in public, which is quite inconsistent in the sense that if the CIA was powerful enough to pull off 9/11, they could kill you quite easily. So you wouldn't want to actually say that. So they don't have this, they have some emotional reactions to these conspiracies, but they're really muted compared to someone who has seen actual evidence. But by contrast, they are very vocal. Like a lot of them are really very vocal, which is then again the opposite of what you see with someone who has formed an intuitive belief because they've seen actual evidence. So you have really these two causal pathways. One is you see actual evidence, you form an intuitive belief that someone in your company is a crook or that there's more widespread corruption in your company or in your government. And your reactions are really strong emotionally and you're being very careful versus someone who has heard of something and they're happy to profess these views because it allows them to justify their mistrust of government or for some other reasons, or they can kind of score points with people who are similarly inclined. And you have these really two things that are completely different in reactions. And so the reason why we have intuitive beliefs is obvious, is because they guide our behavior in the world. That's how we know we can act adaptively. And the reason why we're able to hold reflective beliefs is more subtle, obviously. So the basic cognitive mechanisms that allow us to have beliefs that are encapsulated, that are detached from the rest of our cognition, is that we have to have that to entertain the idea that other people can be wrong. So if you tell me something and I think you're wrong, I have to be able to think, well, David thinks that, without that thought affecting at all my behavior directly. So it can affect my behavior in the sense that I can tell you you're wrong, or I can act in a way that takes into account the fact that I think you have that belief. But if you think a given restaurant is great, but I think you're completely wrong, I'm not just going to go there because now I think it's great. Um, and so we have to have that ability to separate some beliefs from the rest. What's tricky with reflective beliefs is that on the one hand, they are held in that little box in which we usually keep things that we think are false. But the official attitude we have towards these beliefs is that we believe them. And so that's so that we know it's cognitively possible to have things that are insulated because it has to be the case for us to be able to hold to think that other people think things that are false or that we think are false. Um, and sometimes it just so happens that these beliefs can stay there even though we supposedly have reasons to believe that they're true. And it's not completely clear why they stay there. So there are so Dan's examples typically are things that we can't understand. So if a child who accepts that something about the Holy Trinity, his mind just you can't have an intuitive belief about the Holy Trinity because your mind doesn't know what to do with it. It's just not something that we evolved to deal with. But something like a conspiracy theory, your mind knows what to do. Like if you had actual evidence that when you have actual evidence of a conspiracy, your mind knows exactly what to do with that information. So it's not entirely clear why it's possible both for you to think you have enough evidence to accept it, like you don't think it's false, but at the same time to not act on that basis. And I don't really know actually, to be honest, why that happens.
Hmm. Interesting. Um, so, I mean, m the way I'm starting to think of it is that we draw all sorts of inferences about people based on their actions, and one category that we are eager to draw inferences about people toward is the category of belief. So what you believe gives me a lot of inferences about your character, about your personality, your loyalties, your commitments, etc. And what I've written about myself is that as soon as you have a Q-based inference where everyone in a society is drawing an inference, if X, then Y, well, that creates a social incentive for everyone to transform that Q into a signal. So if I start drawing the inference about you, that if you believe that fetuses are people, therefore you are a loyal Republican, well, that gives you an incentive to conspicuously signal that you believe fetuses are people to get me to think that you're a committed Republican, right? So as soon as if you have a Q-based inference set up, that creates an incentive for it to turn into a signal or an intentional signal. And so I think what's going on with a lot of these reflective beliefs is it's just what happens when everyone draws the same inference, Q-based inferences about a particular belief, and then all of a sudden it transforms into a signal. So if you believe in the Holy Trinity, you're a loyal member of the group. As soon as we all make that inference, it creates an incentive for everyone to try to conspicuously signal that they believe in the Holy Trinity. And in that case, it's not necessarily an intuitive belief. It's a social signal. You could think of it as a pseudo belief. I'm trying to mimic the superficial properties of belief in order to get you to think certain things about me, to think that I'm a loyal Christian. You could think of it as more of a social strategy than a belief per se. And so I think one way that these kind of reflective beliefs can come about is through kind of social signaling mechanisms. And it's a pseudo belief in the same way that pseudoscience is a mimicry of science. It's the same. It arises in the same way as any other kind of pseudo process where there are benefits to be had by mimicking a certain thing. And then this happens in beliefs just as it happens in a wide variety of cases in our culture. What do you think about that way of thinking about it?
Yeah, no, no, I think it's part of the answer in many cases. But so for something to become culturally widespread, you have to have some motivation to share it, and that's what you're describing.
Yeah.
But people still have to have some, like at least at the beginning to kick off the process, people have to have some motivation for accepting it as well. And so the mechanism still has to pass at least a minimum threshold of epistemic vigilance. And so, conspiracy theories are, I mean, the ones that are the most popular are the ones that are the somewhat credible. Like, a lot of people believe Kennedy, there was something fishy. And, even if it turns out that it's ultimately false, you can see why that would be kind of, broadly plausible for many reasons. Whereas the people who hold the ones that, that they thought the Queen of England was a lizard person, these are people these are vastly less popular, and they only spread in an audience of people who already believe things that are a little bit kind of crazy for most people. So so you still need to explain. So even if there's this signaling component, for the thing to become widespread and to really entirely then be able to fulfill its signaling component, people still need to accept it in some way. Like, you couldn't, I mean, if you take a population that has kind of normal priors, you can't just decide, well, now all going to signal that we believe the moon is made of cheese because the thing is not going to spread in the first place. So you still have to have some reason why people are accepting the thing at some point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, there needs to be some way of keeping the signal honest. And it could be that, only people who are actually committed to the group are willing to send the signal, and because that in effect alienates you from outgroups. So if everyone in our group believes in the Trinity, everyone in the outgroup rejects that belief. Merely by saying that, merely by uttering that belief becomes a kind of costly signal because I'm burning bridges with the outgroup. Right. And so that could be one way of maintaining signal honesty. Another way is maybe I pay some cost. So if people who believe in Jesus are go to these rituals and make these sacrifices, maybe I perform those rituals and make those sacrifices, even if I don't truly believe in an intuitive level in the particular God or spirit. If I'm making the sacrifices, that could maintain the honesty of the signal. And in other cases, maybe it is just a deceptive signal just in the same way that pseudoscience is a deceptive signal. It's not really science, but just people just get fooled. It happens, and maybe it'll the trickery will persist for some amount of time. Maybe at some point people will discover it, and the pseudoscientist will. His reputation will collapse, and then a new pseudoscience will emerge that tries to mimic some other superficial property of science, and you get this kind of arms race between deceivers and deceived. So that's another path that these kinds of pseudo beliefs could take. But yeah, that's sort of how I'm thinking of it. That either it remains a deceptive signal, in which case you get a kind of arms race, and sometimes it persists and sometimes it doesn't, or it has a kind of bridge burning function, or it takes on some kind of cost that makes the signal persist.
Okay, no, no, these are all interesting possibilities that must apply in some cases. Like I'm just, yeah, I guess the point I was trying to make is that it seems that if what you're saying already takes for granted that the belief is widespread enough that it can be used as a reliable signal. Like, you have to know that Republicans, as a rule, believe that fetuses are people.
Hmm.
But so why, how did that belief become widespread in the first place? Like people, obviously in that
Yes.
case, it's a very, and you can see why it's an appealing belief. Like it's not absurd,
Yeah.
and so it has to have some intrinsic plausibility to spread in the first place.
That is true. Yeah, it cannot be totally insane. But the reason why it might exist in the first place is because there's an abortion debate and people are trying to come up with justifications for their side of the issue, and people who are coming up with a particular justification, well, that's going to license a pretty strong inference that you're on one side of that issue if you're making those arguments. For the same reason, a conspiracy theory. If I hate the Democrats. And I think that the Democrats are part of some deep state conspiracy, that you're liable to make a pretty strong inference that I hate the Democrats if I'm believing in this story, right? And so that's another way it could come across, where maybe the belief doesn't exist at all, but merely because I'm positing this conspiracy theory that demonizes the outgroup, that's going to cause you to make an inference about me that I hate the outgroup, and maybe I'll anticipate that, and that gives me a reason to come up with a conspiracy theory in the first place.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I know we're a little bit running low on time here. I want to push on one thing that I think a lot of people are probably thinking, which is there's this large category of sort of propaganda, right? Or like advertising. So something like, smoking makes me look cool, or like sugar reminds me of like happy holiday things. Like we know that, like the history of like selling cigarettes or like corn and sugar subsidies in the US, like whenever people have looked at this, it's sort of like clear that things are not healthy. Yet people spend tons and tons of money to convince people to hold the explicit belief, the reflective belief that these things, at least I have a positive association with, because there's a small set of people who directly benefit, right? And they're in a position to manipulate the reflective beliefs of people. In those cases, how does this theory, and I'm imagining people sort of have these examples in their head, how does this, can you kind of walk us through how like this idea of like reflective or intuitive beliefs, or that people aren't gullible, how does this work? Because I think the principle would apply whether we're talking about a mass society or even in a small scale social world. For example, like, I'm an old I'm an old person and I want the stuff in another group, and I convince the young guys to like be belligerent towards them. It's not in their interest at all. They might die, so I'm going to send these guys off to war, basically. Like this trope is common where I sort of try to convince people of beliefs, and I do sometimes, that are not in their interest. So I want to push on that just because I'm imagining people are thinking about that too.
No, no, that's a great point. Thanks. Like on the whole, these things work because they tap into things that people want to do in the first place. So people, like sugar for pretty obvious evolutionary reasons. People like nicotine for reasons that are less clear evolutionarily because it's not really good for us. But nicotine is, is very nice. Like
It's a
there's a
pesticide.
reason people
Ed
smoke.
Hagen,
There's
Ed
no-
Hagen episode. There's a good reason. There's a pretty clear, yeah,
Yeah,
reason
no, but
why
that's so
people make it. Yeah,
it's yeah, and even that like the psychoactive effects of nicotine
yeah,
are
exactly.
obviously very pleasant for many people. Um, so what advertising can do then is, first of all, it can make you aware of a product that you didn't know existed. So if I've never heard of chocolate, maybe I see chocolate, it's like, that looks really interesting, and maybe you try chocolate and you like it. Um, or it can give you justification for doing something. If you say, oh, there's a sale on chocolate, so I'm gonna buy chocolate but obviously you wanted to buy chocolate in the first place. You're just looking for a way of justifying, to yourself and to others that it's fine to buy chocolate even though it's not the healthiest of foods. Um, and to some extent, the same is true for even sending young men to war. Like some young men, to some extent, want to show that they're brave and they want to do things like fighting. And you have and young men will fight. I mean, it's not always, and obviously there's wide variation across societies, but in most societies, young men have a tendency to want to use violence more than other demographics. And it's one way that they can show their physical prowess. And so you're just capitalizing on something that's already there. And indeed, I mean, it would be much harder if you wanted to convince, older women to go to war. It'd be a harder sell. Or if you want to convince everybody to start eating kale. I think, we can see the failure of communication by the failure of health messages. Like people still drink too much soda, they still eat too much bad food, they still not eat enough vegetables after decades of being told that it's good or bad for us, respectively. So if it was that easy to persuade people to eat or to do things, the positive messages that are not completely failing but that are not widely successful, let's say, would be more successful by kind of by symmetry.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, I guess one way of putting it is sort of there, at least the way I think about it is, there's people who are sort of getting the short end of the stick, and they think they're the victim of other people's sort of confabulations, right? So sort of like the way they might rationally prefer, like, do I want to go to war or not? But what's their view of war, right? Or like, do I want sugar versus something healthy? Well, what are the offerings presented to me, and how expensive are they? Right. So sort of, I think when people say like people are gullible or duped or the victims of other people's beliefs, I suspect that it's that conflict of interest thing where there's a small group of people who are sort of incentivized
Yeah, because you
to
disagree with
restrict.
them.
Yeah.
Like you disagree with these or you moralize these people's choices. So you think, oh, people are buying SUVs because they've been brainwashed by automakers. But no, a lot of people just like SUVs. Like most of the things that some people think have been pushed on us by advertising are
Uh,
just things that
Oh,
people
let me
naturally
push back on
want.
that because I don't agree with that. So like a good example is like when I go to Germany, fresh, healthy fruit and vegetables are easy. People want them. There's not a lot of sugar and stuff. Here in the US, sugar and corn are subsidized. Everything is super sweet. Every American I know who goes to Germany is like, this is great, and I like lose weight, and they come back and they gain weight. Nobody wants it, but it's sort of it's just the choice architecture because of lobbying and ads and just sort of that. So I think like that to me would be a clear case of like it's not there are different like stable norms where like people do if they're addicted to sugar and refined flour, for example, like they'll just keep doing it. But if they had a choice between the two, like I've run that experiment anecdotally, and like people don't prefer it. But if don't give them that choice, then they're just sort of stuck at this one equilibrium.
Yes, but what works is manipulating the actual incentives and that is
Right.
making it really available, making it cheap, making it
Yes,
the default
exactly.
option.
Yes,
That
yes,
works. It's not, you don't need advertising for people to
yes.
buy M&Ms. I mean, you just need to buy to make M&Ms available at every counter and to make them cheap, and people will spontaneously gravitate towards that.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't because even as having a child, there are certain things that you wouldn't know about, like as you said, like unless you advertise them. Yeah, but yes, the advertising has to be hooked up to like there being a reason
If you
for
give your
wanting it.
child ice cream, you don't need advertising. They're gonna like most children are gonna like ice cream
Right.
because it's just very very good.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you give your most children are not going to like vegetables, as you should be in a good position to know, not because of your children, but because of your wife. They'll be a bit reluctant maybe at first to eat these kind of products, and I think it's rare the parent who's I mean it happens because people have different tastes, but as a rule, I think parents' experience is it's easier to get their kids to eat ice cream than to eat broccoli. And that's just the way it is. Yeah.
Right. But it's interesting there's more ice cream ads than broccoli ads. That's a separate and unpredicted outcome, right?
Yeah, that's partly because there are different brands of ice cream. There's only one. People don't discriminate broccoli. They're buy broccoli or not. So no one making broccoli really has an
Mm,
incentive to say, well, you have to buy my broccoli. Whereas people who make, and it's interesting because that's when ads have some, they can work because you have 10 brands of ice cream and they're all pretty much the same. They're all pretty much the same price. So your choice within the ice cream category, your choice can be somewhat influenced by ads because, they're all the same essentially. Whereas the choice
mhm.
between ice cream and broccoli, that's not going to be the ad. That's just because the ice creams are better.
Yeah, that's a beautiful illustration of your principle when, you have no strong reason or no strong prior to pick one ice cream over the other. That is precisely the case where arguments are going to sway you one way or the other because you don't really care what ice cream you buy.
Yeah,
And, maybe some ad will sway you to buy that ice cream. But if you don't really care, you're not really being manipulated. You're just,
yeah.
whatever. It
And then
doesn't
if
doesn't
you,
matter to you. Yeah.
what the literature and advertising suggests is that if you don't like that ice cream, then you're not going to buy it again. Like it's not going to
Yeah.
change your perceptions. Maybe it's going to, so and then if you do like it, then maybe you're stuck buying that ice cream for a long time. So it can have some influence at the margin,
Yeah.
but only for decisions that are from your point of view as a consumer, it's like Coke or Pepsi. I mean, they're the same product at the same price. From
Yeah.
your perspective, it doesn't make any difference which one you pick, but obviously from their perspective, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
Right. And it
Well,
scales. So broccoli is advertised at the grocery store when there's a couple of different versions of broccoli, for example. Right. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I'm going to ask the question that Dave usually asks because I know we have to wrap up. Is there anything that we should have asked you, Hugo?
No, I mean, I think no, it was great. No, it was great. No, no, fantastic.
We didn't tell him to say
Um,
that.
no, no,
I actually,
no, no. I
I
mean, they're really
actually,
good questions.
I
I mean,
have a
I was
question that I wish I asked you. I've been dying to ask you this the whole interview.
okay.
So,
Well,
so we talked about intuitive and reflective beliefs.
yeah,
If you had to guess, just on an intuitive level, what percentage of our culture, of our verbally articulated beliefs, what percentage of them are actually intuitive beliefs that guide our behavior?
okay.
Bringing it back to
So obviously,
percentages. Good callback, David.
Yeah, back to
yeah.
percentages.
Obviously, a lot of culture is fiction, like especially in contemporary
Mm.
cultures, a lot of culture is fiction, which by definition
Mhm.
is not even a belief in the sense that, it's something you
Let's
have
say
a credible attitudes towards.
excluding explicit fiction.
Well, I mean,
Are you saying Santa Claus isn't real,
Do,
David?
do,
Are you saying Santa Claus
do.
isn't real?
I'm trying to think of broad categories. Like if you
So
exclude
there's like stuff we
fiction,
read in the
obviously
news or think pieces, stuff we talk about in everyday conversation, you
very
know.
little of that is intuitive. Yeah, I would say very, very little. Either because it's too complex for you. Like if you hear that there's something about a trade treaty or something, or I mean, the things that are intuitive, like if you hear about, there has been a flood in Myanmar or something, or an earthquake in
Mhm,
Myanmar, you might have an intuitive grasp of that, but it's very fleeting because, you don't really care. And, 5 minutes
mhm.
later, you've forgotten about it. So for things that are more durable, I would say the overwhelming majority probably is reflective. And that's true for like most of science as well. Like not only for lay people, but
Yeah.
nearly most scientists, our beliefs are reflective because either the format is something that makes it impossible to be intuitive, uh, or because they don't really impact directly our behavior. So yeah, no, I would say
Something
that
like
most things are
70-30,
reflexive. I
something in the ballpark of
I
there.
I would have to think harder about
Yeah.
what the beliefs are that we're talking about.
Hmm.
But yeah, a lot more than we think, I guess, would be
Yeah.
reflexive. Yeah.
Well, it
Yeah, that
reminds
that
me.
is
Oh,
my
sorry, Dave.
intuition as well.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of writing a blog post called "You Don't Believe Most of What You Believe,"
But
and
you do. I mean,
Believe
that's the
it.
thing.
yeah,
I mean,
Believe it.
yeah,
when I believe in like vaccination or relativity theory,
yeah. Mhm,
I believe it. Like it's not, I have a
yeah.
critical attitude towards it, and I would defend it to other people, and I have reasons for it. So it is a belief. It's just not an intuitive belief.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah. It reminds me of there's this quote, and we've already established that I don't remember quotes well, and quotes are have suspicion, but it's just this thing of like, don't count on somebody to believe something that their career, like making money. I'm terrible at I'm
Yeah, if their
slaughtering the
paycheck
quote.
depends on it or
Yeah,
something.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yes. So
yeah.
it's sort of collectively, like very little of our epistemic landscape is sort of things that our paycheck depends on, or conversely, it's sort of like if I worried about the flood in Myanmar, or if I worried about, all of these other things, it doesn't help me. Like knowing how my iPhone is made and the conditions of those people, that actually hurts me in the sense of it takes up time away from, like, feeding my family, or, I might end up having to give up my phone, which I like. So sort of in a very selfish way, we have these very rich landscape of beliefs, but not a lot of them have teeth, maybe is a way to put it.
No, 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 no. I mean, one way of thinking about that maybe is that usually there's a trade-off between um, between two forms of relevance. Like most of the beliefs we have are relevant only to us. Essentially, no one cares. It's like, everything I know about my work and my personal life, and I mean, they're mostly relevant to me. So they don't become cultural, and they're mostly accurate and they're mostly intuitive. But when you want to have beliefs that will be relevant to a lot of people, by definition, these beliefs can't be these kind of local relevant beliefs because no one cares
You're
except
describing the
yourself.
podcast.
Well, so no, I was gonna explain that. And so to have something very, very general, it has to be something that is going to be really hard to have something that's very general and very relevant to a lot of people, kind of by definition. So given that, it's kind of bound to be the case that typically, like, I mean, the exceptions would be things like, if there is an emergency, there's an earthquake, and you're giving really practical information about what to do in case of an earthquake, and then you have the whole population who has that belief, well, if there's an earthquake, I have to do this, which is intuitive, because it so happens to be something that can be widely shared and that is really kind of relevant locally to a lot of people. And it's really rare, the beliefs that have these properties.
Yeah. Cool. That's why the Weather Channel is always scary stuff, because it seeds the epidemiological epistemic landscape. Hugo, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
This
you
is a
guys. That
very
was great.
dense, efficient conversation. It was lovely. We'll have to have you back on for banter and
My
hearing more
pleasure.
about all the things that are, extra scientific about you.
Yes,
That
thank
sounds
you.
good.
Thank you very much. Intuitively, now I'm tempted to sign my emails to intuitively instead of sincerely.
Intuitively yours.
Intuitively yours.
I look for that in your greeting, David. So,
Yep.
but yeah, Hugo, thank you so much for your time and for recording this in the evening for you over in on the other side of the globe.
Yeah, you have a Frenchman still at work at nearly 8. My God, it's a
Exactly.
miracle.
Yes, it's good. Yeah, thank you again, and yeah, we'll talk soon.
That sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Well, David, people have a little bit of extra time in their day.
They certainly do. And with that extra time, they can leave us a kind review or say something nice on social media or even check us out on Patreon.
Or go for a walk, or help
That too.
somebody with, I don't know, assemble their furniture or clean their house, or I don't know, do something you've been putting off, with this half hour free of time.
Yeah, that's also a nice thing you can do. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
but
but be thinking about us while you do those things.
okay, we still got to get you those that fanny pack, David. So please, somebody send
Yeah, I'm
David a
still in
fanny
the
pack.
market, so if you have a fanny pack, please send it my way. I still haven't gotten any.
We
I've
need
been waiting.
t-shirts. We need t-shirts and stickers too. We need more stickers. We did hand out some stickers at HBUS. If anybody wants
That's true.
stickers, let us know.
Yeah, we're drowning in these stickers. We ordered too many.
Oh, do you have stickers? I ran
I
out.
still have stickers left
Oh,
over.
really? Can you send
You
us?
know,
Okay. Well, maybe if you come up. Okay. All right.
you just come to
Well,
my house in Los Angeles. I'll give you some
no,
stickers.
no, no. Don't do that. Don't do that. It's a bad idea. Okay.
All right.
We'll talk to you guys next week.
All right. See you next week.